that. So on the those of you who have been to office hours before know that this is an open question and answer session. But on the last Friday of the month, we tend to pick a theme and talk about something specific. So we hope that today you've come up with your questions about profiles and security settings. But what we also find in these themed sessions is that we tend to do a little bit more show and tell. I put the presenters on the spot, not just to answer questions, but actually to explain some of the things that they share some tips and tricks and tell you about what they like about profiles and security settings. In this case. So, as usual, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You may have questions that follow up from some of the things that we're talking about. So put them in the chat as usual, and we'll try and weave the questions into the conversation that we're having. So I'm delighted to welcome this panel, who have all told me that they really enjoy talking about this topic. So I think, and it's a big topic, so we're not going to cover everything today, but let's try and keep it as much as possible for nonprofits and sort of where nonprofits might start in some of this. And I wonder if we might start with profiles, because I think they're usually the easier one to get to grips with. And also, in a lot of cases, getting the profiles right is more important. So would any of you like to just briefly say what's a profile and what does it control? Why does it matter what profile people have? Anyone? And you can also weave in Norman's question, which is about what's the relationship between profiles and record types.
Sure. Yeah. So just to give a brief overview of profiles. So profiles are going to be your base level of security. It's your most restrictive level. So that's kind of your base for everyone who you work with. So if you're a smaller group, you might only have 1 or 2 profiles aside from the system administrator profile. But that's really going to be where you set up your base level of security, and your most restrictive settings are going to be. From there, you can add on additional access to users through permission sets. And then sharing rules are kind of a separate category along with record ownership in the security settings. So profiles is really about object visibility and field visibility and being able to access certain objects and tabs and those sorts of things. There's also a number of administrative controls and profiles. So whether or not someone is able to, what are some of the admin settings? I'm blanking on them now.
Well, you can use profiles to effectively distribute access to what people can do to records in Salesforce, as Sarah's talking about. So when you look at a user record, when you look at a profile record, they have certain parts to them. Namely, they have what Sarah was talking about, which is like, can I delete contacts? Can I read accounts? Can I read opportunities? And so if you think of every tab at the top of Salesforce, as just sort of bundling together object records, then your profiles can tell you what you can do with the records bundled in those tabs, and then which fields on those tabs which fields on those records you can actually access. I like to, talk about how to think about security access from the perspective of profiles, and that is, it basically puts together a means by which you don't have to have everybody running as a system administrator, which is very, very detrimental to your data. And it gives sort of, system permissions to what people can do. So if if you think of the records as, what you can do to a record, which is half of what a profile governs, then the other half of what a profile governs is what you can do within Salesforce itself. And those are the areas that are like system permissions. Can I send emails from Salesforce? Can I, access encrypted fields? And, to sort of take it all the way back to the original question about record types, one of the things that's useful about profiles is that every object's worth of information, you can assign specific record types to a profile. So maybe your program users have a profile that can see 2 different kinds of contact record types, and your fundraising users have a profile that can see 3 different kinds of contact record types. And if you think about what record types are capable of accomplishing, meaning governing things like field pick list values and governing, to specific page layouts, what you have starting from the bottom up in a profile is an easy way of giving large groups of people access to very specific views, very specific field values, and very specific ways of working within Salesforce governed by your profiles. And the chatter conversation on the side is about role hierarchy and sharing, and that is a separate strategy, as we were already talking about.
Yeah, and for the record types and setting up record types for profiles, it's important to know that you can set up a default record type for each of your profiles. So as Tracy was saying, if you have a program team that only uses one certain type of contact record where they've got all these program-specific fields, you can set up a record type for that and have that be their default in their profile. And then you can have your fundraising team have a different default profile or default record type for, let's say, major donor or donor contact types that have all of that donation information.
So yes, I don't know whether you can see on my screen, there's this difference here, isn't there, between the assigned record type, which means can you actually see it at all, and the default, which is, as you've just been explaining, the one that it kind of always defers to, or the first one in the list when you try to create a new record, whatever.
Right. Yes, and we can see your screen.
So record types are a great one to control by profile. What about page layouts? Because the profiles can be really useful with page layouts as well, can't they?
Right. Yes, so typically you're going to assign page layouts primarily by the record type. You can also determine, based on someone's profile, which page layout assignment that they'll get by record type. So this is a little bit more nuanced than just assigning record types to profiles. It's actually determining who sees what page layout for which record type.
So Norman has, yes, he's done a follow-up. So he says if I want certain users to see different screens, I think, or different views of information, I guess, would I usually do this through specific page layouts directly instead of using record types? Tracy, can you explain your comment a little? Record types and page layouts are paired together.
Sure. So what you can do inside of Salesforce, if you think of, I'm trying to think of a good visual metaphor and I'm failing on it, but I think the important thing is if you think of like a page layout is generally always paired one-to-one with a record type. It doesn't have to be, though, right? You can have, you can actually have more than one record type have the exact same page layout, or vice versa. Actually, you can have, those kind of assignments work because it's a many-to-many relationship. But if you think about, like, say for example, I only wanted a specific group of people to see 10 fields on a contact record, then you would create a record type that is specific to that group of people. Maybe it's membership management. And you would create a membership management page layout and assign it to the membership management record type. And by doing so, you can then take that little pairing and you can assign that pairing, as Sara was talking about, to a profile as either the default, view for that specific object. So you can make that, the specific view for the people who have the membership profile. That is the default page layout they get for contacts. And that's all they're able to see. So, the trick here is that, how do we make these cuts across our programs and across our organization? And generally, for small organizations, you only need one, maybe two. And, it's usually larger organizations with more sophisticated needs where you have different groups of people using contacts for different purposes, for example, or accounts for different purposes, or opportunities for different purposes, which is a commonality for a lot of organizations because you have, major gift opportunities, you have grant opportunities, you have, individual donation opportunities. So, the way to think about this is how much time and effort do you want to put into governing these page layout and record type pairings on your profile level. So a general rule that I try to give everybody is if you don't have a lot of time to maintain and administer Salesforce, it's generally a good idea to think about cutting your users into two groups of people. The system administrators who can do everything and everybody else who only can do a few things. But as your organization grows in sophistication and complexity and you're able to put more time into, maintaining different security strategies, that's where you can grow on that pyramid. You can start saying, well, it was good to have a general group of users who can do some things, but now from that general group of users, some of them have specific needs that are programmatic based and some of them have specific needs that are fundraising based. And that might be a good rationale for setting up, two profiles, one for mission-driven kind of delivery folks and one for mission-driven fundraising folks. And yes, Norman, the answer to your question is yes. If you want to just keep things simple, you actually don't have to use record types at all. You can just, have no record types assigned to, your objects and just have the default page layout come up for that record.
I think that can be a great strategy for contacts, particularly. I mean, what do the rest of you feel? Are you in the yes, use record types, or basically manage a whole load of things with page layout camps? Because I think there tend to be two of them.
Different opinions on that one.
Yeah, Aiden, what's your feeling about it? Do you push people towards record types or?
So I would use record types generally for two reasons. One is usually if people have two different page layouts for program versus fundraising, for example, record types also allow you to control the pick list values that everybody sees. So the development team, when they create an opportunity, they may, or whatever record they're creating, you could set it so that the pick list values that they might see would be option 1, 2, and 3. But the other group or another profile that when they go to create the opportunity, they selected separate record type, the pick list values that they might see would be values 4, 5, and 6. So record types give you control not just over what page layouts they're seeing, but also the pick list values that they're seeing. So that's another reason to do it. You can also trigger workflows and processes and flows to do different things, or even formulas to do different things based upon your record type. But you can't do it based upon the page layout. So if I want something to happen automatically when I select an individual donation page layout, I'm actually referencing the record type of individual donation. I'm not looking at the page layout that's happening. So that allows, if I have a one-to-one relationship on that opportunity, sorry, I don't need a one-to-one relationship, but if I have a record type, I can say if it's donation record type, then do this, or if it's grant record type, then do this. But I can't do that just based upon the page layout assignment. So, and the third thing, that if you're looking at the opportunity, a record type gets assigned, so then I can go back in and I can do my reporting and my filtering, say I only want opportunities that are grant record type versus donation record type. Again, that's not something I can control by just having multiple page layouts assigned to profiles. I think it's better to do multiple profiles and assign record types that determine which page layout I'm seeing.
Yeah, I would say that having just page layouts, you're going to hit some limitations. Certainly, I think it's ideal to keep the number of record types low, so that you're not having too much to manage. Because there were a few comments in the chat about how it does become a lot to manage if you have multiple record types and multiple page layouts and assignments all over the place. So if you can, and I think the contact case is a good one to have just page layout assignments by profile, because if you've got those two different teams who, for the most part, don't need to see the other people's fields, you can just manage that by page layout. But if you've got, the program team needs to be able to see sponsorship opportunities and be able to create those, and also be able to create basic gift opportunity types, you're going to have to use record types and not just page layouts.
But keep in mind that record types are not security. Record
Yes.
types don't determine what and I said it in the chat a few minutes ago, and we all have a tendency to say it this way, but record types do not determine which records you see. Record types determine which record types you can create.
Right.
So when I go to opportunity and click new, if I have the record types individual donation and grant in my drop-down list, they're the two record types I can create. But if the sharing rules are set up properly, or if the sharing rules are set up in such a way that even though I can't create a major gift opportunity, but Tracy can, then I would still be able to see that record type. I would still be able to see that record. And I would be able to see the page layout if we both had the page layout assignment for our profile. So I would be able to see all of the fields on the major grant that she opened up, but I wouldn't be able to create a major grant. So that's something to remember, is that record types are not security. If you want to get into who can actually see a field or who can edit a field in reporting or just off of the record, then you're into profiles and permissions at the field level security.
Right.
So
Yeah, I just want to point out, I'm also in the camp of, like, particularly when you're starting out with Salesforce as an organization, I'm very much in the camp of keep your security stuff as simple and pragmatic as possible. And the reason being is because, what I like to encourage organizations to think about is, if you're 10 people, all you really need is one system administrator, and then you have everybody else. To Aiden's point, record types, are only a way of determining very specific user experiences. They're not going to give you any, security advantage, but they're also one of the big mistakes that I see, and I put this in chatter, is that sometimes people will want to actually categorize objects. So it's one of those things where it's like, if I'm a volunteer, do I really need a volunteer record type for my contact record, or do I just need a pick list that says active volunteer, non-active volunteer? And organizations do this a lot with accounts and contacts, and it really muddles things up about 2 years down the road, because suddenly what you wind up in your Salesforce instance with is 5 account record types: nonprofit, foundation, government, business, corporation, or something like that. And those really aren't record types. If you're not treating those things differently from the perspective of your organization to the point where field values, profile access requirements, and all of that stuff would change, those really aren't record types. That's just a pick list. And that's where, starting out small is to your advantage, because you'll eventually, I'm almost a huge proponent of, like, get to the point where you're starting to feel real pain around what's showing up on your page layouts and record types before you start adding to it. Because if you start with trying to make it super sophisticated first, it's actually to your detriment about 2 years out. And then, of course, which object, it also matters. The high-level objects like accounts, contacts, campaigns, the more record types you add there, the more difficulty it may actually become when you start also doing things like integrating third-party applications, because then you have to consider which record type is my third-party application creating and under what conditions. Low-level objects, like if you create like another object that hangs off of opportunities and it's like some sort of bizarre little categorization object, that's where, like, if you really want to put like 10 record types, fine, go ahead, because none of your integrated applications are going to see them, and sometimes those little record types are just easy for like users to sort of button click create specific things rather than have to think about it once they're on the record. But, especially for the high level stuff, contacts, accounts, opportunities, sometimes, campaigns, definitely. Don't go record type crazy when you're first starting out with Salesforce. It's really going to be to your detriment down the road.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Especially for contacts. I mean, if you've got a record type and a page layout for a volunteer and for a donor and for whatever other type of contact you have, then your contacts can't be multiple of those things, which all of your contacts should have the potential to be a donor. So you run into these, you've created silos within your system that you really don't need to have.
And I find that the clients who have them tend to end up with a lot of duplicate contacts as well, because somebody's in one of these record type silos, and if somebody's searching for a contact, they don't necessarily find. They're trying to put somebody in a different context. It tends to be a really good way of ending up with duplicates. But I think we should just point out you do need some record types on account, don't you? Particularly if you're using the nonprofit starter pack.
You do, but remember that, the nonprofit starter pack actually adds the household record type and the household layout, so you can subsist just fine with all of your profiles having the organization record type and the organization page layout as their default for accounts, because the household record type and the household layout in the nonprofit success pack is only accessed by the tool itself. It's very, very rare that you would manually create a new household account record in that.
Right. Because NPSP, whenever you create a contact, automatically creates that household for you.
Precisely.
And good name drop on the success pack name change.
Yeah.
Yes. So for those of you who are looking at this is the nonprofit starter pack. But I think the world has generally decided it's much more than starting out, and so the NPSP is now the nonprofit success pack. And the other thing that I also wanted to point out was that for some of you whose Salesforce instances have been established a bit longer, your profile page may not look quite like this. You may have, when you may go into it, you may not have all these sort of drop-down tabs here. Don't worry, you have exactly the same settings. They're just laid out in a different format. And this is, I can't remember, is this called the enhanced profile view or something?
That's the enhanced.
Yeah. So there's an old layout and a new layout, and you can change it.
And it also changes again when you enable Lightning.
That's a whole nother conversation, isn't it?
I like to switch back and forth between the two, so depending on what I'm doing. between this profile, between this user interface and the other the old user interface. Sometimes the old one is easier to work with.
It particularly, isn't it, because it has these objects are all sort of laid out in a little table, aren't they? And you can just check the boxes. It's much easier for comparing object permissions, I think, in the old layout.
Yep.
Yep, absolutely.
It does require a lot of scrolling, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Absolutely.
There's also some great apps like the Permissionator, I think, is one that I use fairly regularly, and it compares profile permissions to themselves and gives you a list of what's the same and what's different. And it's a Heroku app, I believe. So you can get it online. It's free, and it just literally says, "Hey, can this app access your Salesforce instance via Heroku?" And if you're in that circumstance where you have like a dozen profiles assigned to a dozen different users, which is kind of sometimes where organizations land, you're like, wow, Sally's got a different profile than John, but they're doing the same things, then tools like the Permissionator can, I think I'm pronunciating that correctly, they can compare your profiles to each other and help you start consolidating things down. Perm Comparator, thank you.
Great. Yes, if somebody could post a link to their website or something, that would be great. Yeah, thank you very much.
There's a couple that are out there. One is the profile comparator for Salesforce that I just posted. The Heroku app is a different one. I'm just looking for the link now.
Perm Comparator is the Heroku app. Here we go.
It's under the Salesforce toolkit. Here we go.
And then
great.
Permissionator is different.
Great. Links are coming up. Excellent. So actually, I think Tracy, what you were just saying about this business of comparing profiles and that some people have different permissions and one thing and another, this may take us in a nice sort of segue into permission sets because, well, perhaps one of you'd like to explain how useful permission sets can be in relation to profiles.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
I can jump on this if nobody wants to. I love permission sets.
Well, go on then. You start.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the best practices that I like to impart to a lot of nonprofits, and this is a segue to permission sets, is I like to say that record deletion, should be a system administrator privilege only. And that doesn't necessarily fit all conditions, but if you're just starting out, it helps you because then your users don't accidentally press that delete key and then get you in that circumstance where you have to recover records. So if we've created an organization where system administrators can delete stuff, but nobody else can, then what may happen about 6 months into using Salesforce is you will have a user who gets super savvy, and you will have a system administrator who gets super stressed, and those two will meet over lunch one day, and the super savvy user will say, hey, I can help you out with stuff if you need somebody who can take on deleting records that people have asked to delete. And the system administrator says, oh, thank goodness, yes. But now you don't want to give that person a full system administrator profile, and maybe you only have one general profile for all your users. What do? This is a good use case for a permission set, where permission sets open up additional access to stuff inside of Salesforce on a one-off basis for very specific users for very specific reasons. So in that example, the system administrator would go create a permission set saying record delete privilege, and they would create that permission set and say, great, this permission set allows accounts, contacts, opportunities, and campaigns to be deleted. And then system administrator would assign that permission set to a very specific user who then suddenly, in addition to everything that their profile allows them to do, can also now delete those records. And that's what a permission set empirically does, is it gives one-off functionality to very specific individuals for very specific reasons where Previously, what you would have had to have done is create a whole separate profile for that person. This kind of alleviates that need.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that permission sets didn't used to exist. It used to just be everyone was adding more and more profiles so that at a certain point, each user had kind of their own custom profile, and profiles were hell to manage. So the idea with permission sets is that profiles have this base level that everyone can have, and then permission sets you give to individual users so that they can have their own, whatever they work with. Maybe it's a set of fields that only they should see. It gives that individual customization without having to create a whole new profile.
The one where I've found this really useful, or the example, is for something like online online donation processing. I have some clients who are using IATS brickwork, and it's really useful to keep the kind of IATS brickwork stuff separate from everything else and just grant permission to see the relevant tabs as part of a permission set. Because it kind of means you can take it across departments. I have a large client who's using it not only for donations, but they also collect some payments for their education program through it. And it's instead of having to create all these really complicated profiles, I can just say, okay, so this person in development needs to be able to look at the IAT stuff, and this person in education, and so on. So it's permission sets are incredible. They're really powerful. And I now think I need to go back and tidy up all those profiles. Go ahead. Sorry, Tracy.
I was just going to say some applications that you'll get off the App Exchange also use permission sets to give access to what that application can do. So a good example for this is the MailChimp application, where you can install the application for all your users, but then MailChimp has two permission sets that it includes. It has use MailChimp and administer MailChimp. And, you can assign those both to a user, or you can assign one to a user, and that can be how you also govern access to MailChimp inside of your Salesforce instance for your users.
Yeah, and the example that's in this particular instance that I'm looking at is for the declarative lookup rollup summaries. That seems to have permission sets that go with it too. So that's a great point. Thank you, Tracy.
Also, I really want to call out something that Aiden put in the chat, and that is permission sets don't take away. If you're in a circumstance, and this happens a lot on the hub, where somebody will say, oh, everybody can do this, but I don't want John to do this. Well, you can't use a permission set for that. And a great example is like if everybody can modify a field that's, for example, HIPAA compliant, except for one person, there's only two ways of solving that. Either you create a separate profile that takes away that person's ability to do that, or your base profile does not allow access to that field, and then you create a permission set to give specific users access to that specific field. And where it gets tricky is, this is in some ways a question of volume, where if I have 30 users that, need to access a specific field and one who doesn't, if you create a permission set, based on a low-level access of you're basically going to have to assign that permission set 30 times if your base profile doesn't give access to that field. So in that circumstance, it's actually probably easier to go sort of the older strategy, and that is create one profile that has access to the field and then create a separate profile for the one person who doesn't, get access to it. But if that were the inverse, if, there was only one person who needed access to a specific field, then you would create your base profile in such a way that the base profile does not give access to that specific field, and then your permission set then extends access to that one field for that one specific user. So the trick with permission sets is, kind of doing a quick assessment of how many times does this condition exist, and weighing that against the creation of a new profile versus, assigning a permission set to like 1 or 2 or 5 people, in your Salesforce world. And that's very explicitly true for very large organizations where, you've got 50 users, 300 users, and, 20% of those 300 users need some additional access. Well, if you've only got 10 users and 20% of them need additional access, that's great if you want to assign a permission set because it's only 2 people. But once you're up at sort of numbers like 300 and 500, 20% of those is like 60 or 80 people. Do you really want to assign the same, permission set 60 times, or do you just want to create a new profile for that group of people? So it really does come down to the question of volume and when you're assigning permission sets.
Yeah, when you're doing anything in Salesforce, there could always be 3 or 4 different ways to do it. But what you have to think about when you're implementing your way of doing it is how easy is this going to be to maintain, and will it be scalable, so that if your numbers increase from 10 to 100 users, is it still going to be a good solution?
And scalable is key. That's a really important thing to know, because also scalable can be planned. Like, if you're doing something where it's like, this works for us when we have 20 people, but we know in 2018 we're going to have 300 people, then sometimes you just plan on making that transition, and that's what makes the approach scalable, and that's fine too.
That's great, and I think Aiden, along with the general rule, as I think we're sort of getting at as well, which is an important thing to remember with these settings, is you always have to start with, as Tracy said, with the most restricted profile and work up from there, can't you? It's all about opening up permission and opening up access rather than trying to shut it down.
And setting. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say setting up your security. Whether with your profiles and permissions and with sharing rules and role hierarchy, depending on your needs, could actually take a while. And you may not get it right the first time. But it's important that you still try to implement it. We haven't talked about it yet. We're 40 minutes into the meeting, but I'm sure Carolyn, Tracy, and I'm sorry, I forget who else is on the call. Sara has also seen or logged into orgs where you see 10 users and all of them are system administrators, because the people who set it up didn't want to bother trying to figure out their profiles and permissions or sharing rules, so they just made everybody else an admin just to make it easy. I like to say that being an administrator is like being God in your organization, and there should only be one God.
Yeah, I like to say that it's one of the most horribly wrong and screwed up things you could ever do to your data.
Unless you're Catholic, we get 2 backups. But there should.
Wait,
but
you
basically,
do?
Yeah.
That's cool.
But the idea is that your administrator profile should be out judiciously. You don't give that to everybody, and if it takes a bit of time to make sure that you've got your profiles and your permissions and your sharing rules down right, so that not everybody's an administrator. I mean, that is something that you have to do. You can't have an org with 10 system administrators in it.
Yes, which makes this a very bad example, but this is only a test environment. But yeah, go ahead, Sara. I think it's an important point to make. So what you were going to say.
Oh, polytheism only works in religion and not Salesforce. That is absolutely true. And I think the important thing to also note is that it's not just about like what you can do to your records. It's like there are some functions inside the Salesforce, world, and most explicitly the nonprofit success pack, that if you have system administrator access to certain things, it can mislead you about what you're doing inside of Salesforce. A lot of the roll-up summaries are like this. If you have system administrator access, you can actually access all of those fields independently of what the nonprofit success pack is doing as roll-up summaries. So, I've seen circumstances where all those users have separate kind of interpretations of what that means then. So like I give a donation and I've seen some organizations where users will just go right to the roll-up summary field and change the dollar amount in the roll-up summary field when I give a new donation because they're system administrators and they have access to that field. So it's really, really critical to take away certain things to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I would say that one thing that can get really out of hand when every user has a system admin profile is field creation. I've seen a lot of instances where there's a super user or someone who has decided they want to customize Salesforce to meet their needs, and they just create a field for everything that they think that they need, and they're creating like first name, last name fields on like a campaign member object where they really don't belong. So it can get a little scary when people who don't know how to use Salesforce are starting to create fields.
Yeah, and that's a really great point too, because when you can take away that setup menu access, but boy howdy, when you're just a new user to Salesforce, it seems like the easiest thing to do is just make it customizable for what I want to do. And
yeah.
A year from now, you won't be able to report on anything because you'll have 3 different fields that all indicate that somebody's a volunteer.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to keep sort of 10 minutes to dig into roles and sharing. But yes, just quickly, some tips. We've had a question here that if you're in that boat and you've inherited a Salesforce instance where everybody is an system administrator, how would you start untangling it?
The way that I've done this with client projects is I kind of start with a drawing, actually. I literally will use a whiteboard and say, okay, in a perfect world, what kind of access to where should people have? And by drawing it out, you're able to see really quickly, does this match the need of profiles? Does this match the need of role hierarchy? What needs are met by drawing out who needs access to what? Then I will generally take those drawings and translate them to just brand new structures inside of Salesforce. Like I think one of the mistakes people make sometimes is they try to take an existing org where there's like a ton of profiles and permission sets and all that stuff and start noodling with them one by one. I actually like to do the sort of nuclear route, and that is I'll just create a brand new profile and be like, here's the perfect world scenario. And pretend as if none of that stuff exists, and build a new set of profiles and permission sets, and then start transitioning my users out of the mess to those new things. Because if you try to keep noodling with the things that are there, you're going to get into this game really quickly of like, what did I change and where for which groups of people? It's almost better when you're in that circumstance from where I've sat to just rip the Band-Aid off and kind of rejigger it, and then just assign people over time, to where they need to go.
You're getting a validation from Stuart, Tracy. He followed that route too, so that's great.
Anyone want to agree with that?
Yeah, anyone want to talk about just very quickly about this this custom checkbox, custom and standard profiles?
Yeah. So whenever you get Salesforce, you're going to get some out-of-the-box profiles. I think it's 6 of them. No, 7. No. Well, anyway, you'll get a bunch of standard profiles that are things like contract manager or system administrator or standard user, and they won't have that custom checkbox on the right. But these users are kind of the basic setup that Salesforce gives you. The tricky part with these is that you can't customize these profiles very much. So typically when you set up a new org or you're starting a new Salesforce org, you're going to take these standard profile types and you're going to clone them to make your own custom profiles. Hit that clone button. Good demoing. So the tricky part about these standard profiles, again, is that you can't do much of any customization on them. They're going to come out of the box with some pretty rigid settings there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly with the custom objects and things that are available in the nonprofit starter pack, it's always best to go for custom profiles. But if you do start out with a trial of the nonprofit success pack, sorry, it'll take a while. If you do start out with the MPSP, you will have there are some profiles that they provide for you, which are kind of nonprofit friendly, and those would give you a starting point as well, because those are custom profiles and you are able to modify them. Okay, I could have called this just profiles, I think, because we're doing very well at just talking about that. But we have about 10 minutes. I mean, not all nonprofits use roles and hierarchy, but would somebody like to just give a quick...
Well, I think it's important to highlight the difference between profile and permission set security and role and sharing security, just to get a base level knowledge of what that means. So if you're thinking of, let's say that you have an Excel sheet that's like a really basic database. So you've got columns in your Excel sheet, and those are like fields in Salesforce. Maybe you've got tabs along the bottom, and those are objects. So those are kind of your metadata within Salesforce. And then the rows on each of those Excel sheets are going to be your records. So that's your data. So that's Sally, who's a contact. That's your Sally contact record. The fields, like first name, last name, those are going to be your columns in Excel. So the metadata, the columns and the tabs, the objects, that's all controlled by profiles and permission sets. The rows, the data itself, so Sally, Smith, and John, and all of those records are controlled by role hierarchy, sharing roles, those settings. So keep that difference in mind when we're talking about these, because it can get very confusing when we're talking about roles and permission set and profile, because they kind of all have similar sounding jargon going on there.
And I think it was Michelle who earlier on, maybe Michelle, who posted the Who Sees What videos. If you wouldn't mind, Michelle, posting that again down the chat, because it's, Who Sees What? Because that's a really good set of introductions to it. But
yeah, there's a whole series on YouTube now, all in the See What series.
Yeah. So, I mean, in most cases, do nonprofits really need to bother about roles? I mean, when would roles come in useful for a nonprofit, do you think?
Generally, you won't need roles or a role hierarchy in nonprofits unless you've got a set of major donor team members who want to have ownership over specific accounts and opportunities that others shouldn't see. That's really the only case that I've come across where it's necessary.
I've used role hierarchy access for very specific needs, such as HIPAA needs. That is sometimes an area where a role hierarchy is helpful between understanding access to constituent records that, privileged HIPAA access allows, and disallowing access to certain groups of records where that is not allowed across your organization. The fundraising example is a great example as well. The use of a role hierarchy is sometimes also helpful when you've got groups of contacts that are Sometimes, and I'm really going to emphasize sometimes, but when you have organizations that work with super high profile people and super high profile organizations, sometimes a role hierarchy is also helpful for disallowing access to certain groups of records. Where, you know, like I was looking inside of one Salesforce instance a number of years ago, and I was like, wow, there is Robin Williams' home address and mobile number right there. And you know, you definitely don't want that information across your entire user base. So that's also sometimes a use for role hierarchies where you have VIP needs or high profile needs. I think the important thing about a role hierarchy is that when you start going down that path, it becomes really easy to overtick the plumbing and stop up the drain. And it becomes its own separate administrative task to understand where your users should sit in that role hierarchy and do they actually have access to what they need to do their jobs. I absolutely agree with Sara. You don't give this to, you know, a tiny 6-person organization just starting out with Salesforce because it requires time and thought to establish, and it requires administrative capacity and planning to maintain.
Yeah, it really does.
For larger organizations that need to segment their data or allow a team so it's not just the role hierarchy, it also allows you to create your sharing rules between those teams. So if you have let's say you have 2 development teams, both of them can be able to edit opportunities. They should be able to see each other's opportunities, but they should only be able to edit those opportunities. So your organization-wide default might be would be read-only, but you create a sharing rule so that you could share those, set up a sharing rule between the 2 teams to allow them to within each team, so that the people within Team A can edit the opportunities owned by the people in Team A, and you'd create a sharing rule so that the opportunities in Team B can be edited by the people in Team B, but A can only view Team B's opportunities, and B can only view Team A's opportunities. So there are reasons for sharing roles in which you'd need roles. The other thing that I like about roles, especially for larger organizations, as soon as you have 2 EDs or 2 VPs of something, and they want to just report on their team's opportunities or their team's accounts, when you set up a role and you say that you've got an ED of East and an ED of West, that you could the ED can go into the opportunity reports and say, show me my team. And he will get, that filter will give him all of the opportunities owned by people below that ED, so that he doesn't constantly have to filter out or hard code a filter to remove the opportunities owned by the team in the other or another team's opportunities. So there are some valid reasons for roles, especially as you get larger. I wouldn't, like Tracy said, I wouldn't start creating roles for a 10-person organization, but as soon as you get into different functions in which you need to be able to control who can see and edit different records, normally you're into sharing rules then, and that generally requires roles to be set up.
Roles are very useful when you have highly complex security needs, and it's really important to understand that they are a sophisticated tool. You know, another security measure that we're not even probably going to talk about today are external object access for Salesforce communities. You know, that's almost like, you know, implementing an entirely different structure based on what's exposed in your Salesforce community. And we're also probably not going to talk about like territory management, account teams, opportunity teams. These are even more ways by which you can extend access based on what's going on in your Salesforce organization. But if you're needing those structures, you've generally got to make sure that you have a plan for exit and entry for all your users into those structures, and that's really the important point. These are things that sometimes people will turn on pell-mell, and then it really gets them down a dark hole, because it's really easy to have 5 sets of duplicate records when you make accounts, private, which is the highest level object inside of Salesforce. So they're very sophisticated tools for very real purposes, and I think, I completely agree with Aiden's point.
Yeah, the one I see that it comes up in the hub is when people are using the Volunteers for Salesforce app. If they have their account or contact set as private, then when new people sign up, it'll keep creating duplicates for them. And that's one example. But yes, where it's interesting because it comes back to this default again of the very restrictive. And really, if you want to use roles, you don't want organization-wide sharing defaults like this, do you? Because at the moment, this is a very public model.
Yeah, I think when folks are first approaching roles and just setting up new users, it's tempting just to set up roles and a role hierarchy just because you want to mimic who's in what position in the organization. I've seen this a lot where a role and a role hierarchy has basically been set up in Salesforce to mimic who's in what position in the organization. So the ED has their own role, and maybe some of the managers have their own role, and there was no thought behind record level access. There was just I need to type in their role right here. So beware of that. That's a common mistake.
Oh, and that reminds me of something. The owner field. Everybody asks this. The owner field does not mean I am the relationship manager for a person, for anything. The owner field is where a role hierarchy is important, and that is a security field. Relationship owning is generally different from who owns the record in a security model. And one of the rabbit holes that organizations can get down really quick is they start using the owner field, like the opportunity owner, the contact owner, the account owner, to designate the person inside of Salesforce who quote unquote owns the relationship with that entity. And that is not what that field is for. Please, 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 for the love of all things holy, don't use it for that. It's connected to role hierarchy, it's connected to security, and if you start using it for just designating the relationship manager for organizations, if and when you need to employ advanced security measures, you're going to have a lot of data unpicking to do.
But on the other hand, you can use it that way, and it can be quite a quick way to sort, particularly for something like Laura suggests, of kind of seeing who needs compensation. No?
Never.
Well, there you are. On that note, Tracy.
Please don't ever do that. Please don't ever do that. Please. It'll get you down such a rabbit hole in about 3 years. Please.
Tracy and I will come back on a future office hours then.
Caroline
since we've
and I
got
will
to 10
debate
o'clock and we'll unpack that. Or it may be actually a good thing to bring to my segue is going to be Office Hours Live. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the panel for this great conversation. I will make the recording available in the hub. But for those of you who are coming to Dreamforce next week, and I hope that many of our regulars are, you have 2 opportunities to come and meet the brilliant members of our panels in person. We are doing 2 sessions of Office Hours Live. We are doing Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We have 40 minutes. And we are doing on Thursday at 3:30. That one's in the salesforce.org lodge. Well, actually, both are at the Westin St. Francis salesforce.org lodge. So please come and join us and bring your questions. And yes, Tracy, maybe if we don't get another question, you and I can continue an argument about role. about ownership. But anyway, thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thanks for the great questions. Keep the conversation going in the hub. Please look at the resource of Who Sees What, which is a great set of videos. And thank you, Stuart, also for the mention of the whiteboards that Shell Black has to explain security. That's a great one too. So thank you very much. And we're, because of Dreamforce next week and then Higher Ed the week after, we actually have a 2-week break, and we'll be back on the next Nonprofit Office Hours session, I guess, on October the 21st. So, see some of you at Dreamforce. Thank you, everybody. And otherwise, see you in the hub. Thank you very much.